Okay, so welcome everyone to Trondheim Kunstmuseum and this discussion about cultural boycotts. My name is Johan Borgesson and I'm the director of the museum. And the background to this, or the reason that we are doing this, besides the obvious situation we are in, is that when something like the invasion of Ukraine happens, there's an immediate feeling that something needs to be done. And not least for cultural institutions and also political institutions, there's a feeling that we need to act, and we need to act quickly, we need to act decisively, and we need to act in a way that is also somehow symbolically potent. And we saw immediately that there were calls for boycotts on different levels. And of course, when there is a need to act, and a need to act correctly, there is also a need to talk about how we should act, and to compare notes, perhaps, before we cancel Dostoevsky courses and Tchaikovsky programs and what have you. So 2 weeks ago, we decided that this would be an opportunity for us to really educate ourselves as an institution, and also to invite to a discussion about cultural boycotts, what to do, what not to do. Are there any easy rules to hold on to in these cases, or do we just have to be very much more diligent about doing our homework? To help us think about these things, we've invited a panel with differing perspectives and different fields of knowledge, fields of study. So we have Yana Mikhalina, who is an artist. She is an artistic research candidate at the Trondheim Art Academy, NTNU, since 2 years. In her practice, she searches for places for female ethics under patriarchy and colonialism. She is invested in documentary practices and works with topics such as sickness and convalescence, Islam, feminism, and psychoanalysis. In this panel, she will touch on the Russian colonial history of the non-Russian indigenous population, and speak to the urgency of a feminization of politics, including the arts, in times of war. Next to her is Fredrik Svensk, who is an art theorist, active as a writer, critic, educator, editor, and curator. Svensk is also the editor-in-chief and publisher of Paletten Art Journal. You see a stack of Paletten next to him. He will offer a note on strategic boycottism, inequality, and the imaginary community of contemporary art. Next to Fredrik is Jørn Holm Hansen, research professor at Oslo Met. Holm Hansen's main academic field of work is politics and public administration in Russia, Poland, and other East Central European EU states, as well as the Western Balkans. Holm Hansen is also conducting applied research, mainly evaluations of development aid and democracy support. And next to me is Trond Aam, director of the House of Literature in Trondheim. Aam has a background in philosophy and the history of ideas, and his work focuses on organizing current social debates and dissemination of literature and research. The House of Literature is one of many institutions that over the past few years has had to deal with several issues relevant to the general debate on freedom of expression and cancel culture. So the way we're going to do this is that initially each of the speakers will present a perspective or a kind of introduction to what they would like to bring to this discussion, and then it will degenerate into a discussion, and then finally into a free-for-all where everyone is welcome to contribute. But we are streaming this, so when we come to the to the public or to the general discussion, it's important that we pass this microphone around. Okay, so Yana, would you like to begin?
Yes, thank you, Johan, and thank you everyone for coming. I really think that it is important, the presence of all of you, and the topic of this discussion is very concrete, cultural boycotts, but at the same time I think it touches upon very fundamental things within the prism of Russian invasion to Ukraine, which has to be rethought at all corners of the world. And of course, for those who've been directly affected by this conflict, being in Ukraine, having friends and relatives in Ukraine, there is no other say that the war has to stop right now. And this is a seemingly simple statement for understanding, but at the same time, there are a lot of complexities behind it. And for me, as I see it, one of the most important questions that comes out of it is how to stop the war after the end of military invasion, after the end of the military actions, because the war happens both on a physical level and on a mental level. And today I want to briefly present two layers of the conflict that I find very important: is decolonization of Russia and feminization of politics in the war times. Just to give a background, Russia is a contemporary colonial state, and after dissolution of Soviet Union, those republics which were geographically located on the edges of USSR gained their independence. It is Ukraine, it is Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Georgia, Baltic states. But those national republics which were located in the center of Russia, in the middle, in the very centers of Russia, because of course it's such a big country, they never managed to separate. And I'm talking about, and currently there are 20 national republics. To name just a few, it's Tatarstan, where I'm from, Bashkortostan, Karelia, Kalmykia, Buryatia, Chechnya, as we all know that there was a big movement in the 90s of Chechen people to separate, and also a crazy war destruction of the whole region, which was initiated by Putin. That's how he came to the power, and which led to the puppet government of Kadyrov, which we're having now in the region. And apart from 20 national republics and indigenous people living there, it's more than 80 ethnicities living on the territory of the current Russia, including Sami people in the north of Russia. So what I think is important to say that Ukraine is not the only target of this white imperialism, which Putin is the heir of. And as a Tatar woman, my claim is that it's to free Ukraine, but also to decolonize Russia, because all these oppressions are interconnected. And yeah, we live in Russia is a contemporary empire, and here I find artistic practice an important terrain and opportunity for mobilization of non-nationalist thinking, because it is extremely painful to see the rise of militarization, the rise of nationalization all over the world. And war is an attack on all life forms, and that's why it is extremely important to preserve the diversity of these life forms, which is being attacked by rhetorics of hatred, which we cannot allow ourselves to go with. And my second point concerns feminization of politics, and here I would allow myself to speak from the position of the affect, because I find it is also very politically important not to remove our emotional engagement from the war discourse. Pain is not a competition, and we have to live in the world where all types of pain can coexist, and it's not about fighting for the territory where one who feels worse. And I think what it requires a fundamental shift from the capitalist logic of psychic economy to feminist logics, where everything has its own place, and we solidarize not with all things at once, but with each of the things on their own terms. I think that art making, in essence, is a female act because it's a gesture that deals with very concrete things, discourses, topics, and female labor is a labor of necessity. It's a labor that comes out of urgency, where ethically you cannot do it any other way. And this is why I think it is very important to speak about war and think about war and fight against the war in the feminist terms, also because of the collectivity that it creates, where every effort is appreciated and included. Totalitarianism is a state of generalization, and that's why it's also it projects a certain kind of big political constructs and manipulate them. And that's why I also think it's very important to break these constructs into a lot of million concrete pieces. And we all have to respond for this war, and this is how I see the responsibility of from our knowledges and the limit of our knowledges. But in this sense, I think it's very important to say that I don't see art as something specific. That I don't see art as some sacred sanctuary territory that has to be preserved no matter what. No, art is an opportunity, the infrastructure which can allow silenced voices to be heard and silenced narratives to be present, because what is at stake is the present and the future, and uninhabitability of the present, which we are experiencing now. And it's not possible to inhabit the present without decolonizing the past, which laid down the foundation for the contemporary nationalist, fascist, homophobic, patriarchal, capitalist Russian state. And I want to end my little presentation with words from the open letter of my favorite filmmaker, Ukrainian filmmaker, Sergei Laznitsa. He was writing about Stalinist discourse, which we are fighting and which we are facing, and the discourse which is based on hatred, which is based on denial of dissent, which is based on implication, assertion of the collective guilt, and a ban of manifestation of a free individual choice. And I believe that culture, as it is something that fights exactly against these things. But at the same time, I also understand that we have to come up with the practical solutions in the current situation, and I really appreciate the title of this panel, what to boycott and what not to boycott, because it also implies the denial of universality of boycotting something or someone just on the basis of belonging, to the nation, to the gender, to the race, and to religion or anything. And I think that we definitely should boycott state institutions, but in Russia, but we cannot boycott individuals, we cannot boycott self-organized initiatives, we cannot boycott LGBT plus communities, we cannot boycott indigenous people, because this is also, I mean, the situation in Russia currently is terrific, and I think this fact that according to the surveys, people in Russia are afraid of tortures more than of death is really saying something about the context in which people are working or trying to work. And this is also what Russian state wants, to silence those voices who resisted and continue to resist, and also now with all the economic sanctions. And I want to again to repeat that it's not, this war is attack on, it's ecological war, it's a humanitarian war, it's feminist. I mean, it touches upon all parts of the society, and we have to continue supporting those who are fighting against it.
So thank you. We have a number of topics there to return to in the discussion. Thank you for that very full and broad picture of the current situation in Russia. So the next introductory presentation will be from Jørn.
That's yes. I'm a political scientist, so my approach is a little bit more, should I say, boring than the presentations of some of my colleagues. But I think we are all in shock now, and we are in anger. This is a horrible attack on a peaceful, relatively peaceful neighbor, and it's unacceptable, and we all want to do something. We are emotional. And it might be that we are urged to do something spectacular, something dramatic, like boycotting everything that has to do with Russia, like boycotting concerts with music composed by Shostakovich, or not going to movies, showing films by Zvyagintsev, not translating modern Russian authors into Norwegian, for instance. I don't think that's a smart approach. It is okay if the point is to feel good, to make us feel good, but this conflict is not primarily about us. It's about other people. First of all, it's about all the people who suffer in Ukraine now, but it is also about people who suffer in Russia, democratic Russians who are now in a very critical situation. And I'm following this quite carefully through Russian media and so on, and speaking with research colleagues that I have in Russia. Last talk I had was 1 hour ago, and I'm afraid it's a question of days before people are getting arrested. So it's about these people, and talking about boycott, it is of course a question of boycotting things Russian. And then I think we should take a look at how the situation is now for Russian cultural workers. There are some examples to illustrate this point. As we know, Russia has gone through a illiberal conservative turn during the last 10 or 15 years. It's more and more traditionalist, more and more reactionary, more and more militaristic. That's an important point. More and more militaristic, more and more aggressive in its kind of what is acceptable argumentation on international affairs, for instance, and also how you treat criminals and other deviant, so-called deviant people. At the end of last year, a document was presented to the people for discussion, for hearings. It was called the strategy for the for the preservation and consolidation of traditional spiritual moral values. It was issued by the Ministry of Culture. And it's, in its contents, it was confirming this illiberal conservative ideology, And it included some promises of increased public funding of culture, more commissioned work from the authorities, and more control. And this was as e-governance, electronic methods of governance is quite widespread in Russia and well developed. They have a strong IT sector. People were invited to vote, and 100,000 people voted in favor, and 70,000 people voted against. So if that was a manipulated vote, I do not know, but still it shows that there is some opposition to this ideology. So that is one example. And another example I came across now, a week ago, was something called, it was a website called Provokatoro.net, which is a way of play with words. It means to the provocator, .no. And on this website, artists, cultural workers are listed with pictures and indication of the name of their projects and the sum of the public funding of the project. And these people are cultural workers who have spoken up against the regime or against the war. And people are encouraged to add new cultural workers to this list if they know about someone in their home city or elsewhere who have spoken up against the regime or against the war and are having projects funded by the state. They are encouraged to list them on this website. So it's there's a number on top of it showing that it's increasing all the time, the number of people on this list. And it tells something. It tells something about a regime that dares to talk about denazifying a neighboring country. And to some extent, I agree. Ukraine should also go through its own memory politics and some of its nationalistic tendencies. But it's not on this level in Ukraine as we see now in Russia. And that is, this is the situation in which Russian cultural workers are operating now. And as I said, it may be, I hope not, a question of days before people are arrested. And should we, this is my rhetorical question, should we be the ones who cut off contacts with democratic colleagues in the cultural sector? And there is an analogy to my sector, the academic field. It's quite similar. Should we do that just one day before the Putin regime puts them in jail? Or fire, or in best case, fire them? So my suggestion is that we should not do this general kind of boycott, but we should do an assessment, case by case. Is this cooperation we are having with the Russian colleagues contributing to strengthen the regime? Then we just say, we will not do it. But a lot of the people we are cooperating with in the academic field, most people, and also I suggest in the cultural field even more, are democratic people who are critical to the regime. And should we be the ones who cut them off? I don't think so. And I also think that doing this case-by-case assessment is good also for us, because it makes us alert, democratically alert, because then we have to continue thinking, what are we doing all the time, instead of just having this very good feeling for 1 or 2 days and then automatizing, in a way, the boycott and just letting it, oh, we don't think about it. We have done it. We are nice people. I think that's a kind of degeneration of our democratic alertness. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. So far we have been very focused on Russia. But of course the issues of boycott are historically, exist through history in a number of different cases. And they appear also in contemporary, in various contemporary situations. So to talk about some of those. Fredrik, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, and yeah, thanks for the invitation, and thank you for your presentations. I mean, I think what I have to share today. I mean, when you asked me to come, Yana, I just couldn't say no. At the same time, I felt like, okay, what do I have to contribute to this horrible situation, being constant chatting with Russian friends and Ukrainian friends, and like, okay, this kind of, I don't know, like, the situation is so intense. But then I thought, okay, perhaps a few things from my perspective as an art critic. As some of you might know, it's been like before the invasion now, like we had a boycott campaign in Berlin against Berlin Kunsthalle. It's still a boycott campaign going on, and the reason for this campaign is basically relating to Gerhard Schröder's connections to an oligarch who financed this new Kunsthalle. Was very close to Putin, and has been able to make, you know, this old Nazi airport called Tempelhof into a Kunsthalle in the middle of Berlin. And there is a lot of protest and a lot of call to boycott here. So and I think for me, I just realized that we have very few boycotts in the art industry. And there are good reasons for this. But there are also sometimes perhaps bad reasons for it. Because it might look as if this boycott against Berlin Kunsthalle, for example, implies a defense of art institutions that work with money from nice entrepreneurs. I mean, if you read Financial Times, you will constantly see this distinction between the oligarchs from the East and the big tech entrepreneurs from the West. But they do depend on the same economic system. So if we understand this boycott, for example, of Berlin Kunsthalle, only as a defense of the bourgeois notion of art, but paid by clean money, then I think we are making a big mistake. As you know, since the Second World War, the culture policies of most European Western states deleted all discourse around proletarian culture and only adopted a liberal notion of culture and art in their culture policies. And in Sweden, where I come from, this already happened in the 30s, when social democracy appropriated a bourgeois notion of culture in favor of growth on the one hand, and on the promise of building the working class. And this was a very successful successful appropriation. But the thing is that now, since the last 40 years, when we know that capitalism globally has stagnated, not in every country, but generally speaking, and we have seen a lot of neoliberal reforms that try to deal with this stagnation. We've seen financialization, we've seen like different kinds of cuts and demands on this and that, and we've seen a lot of in the culture, like a lot of attempts to use culture as a washing machine. So then I thought, like, okay, what can I contribute to this debate around boycott? Except saying, okay, when we boycott something like Berlin Kunsthalle, we are not necessarily defending. When we're boycotting something illiberal, we're not necessarily defending the liberal notion of culture. And let me show you an example. In Gothenburg 2 years ago, a group of artists were invited to an exhibition initiated by the embassy, the Chilean embassy in Sweden. And they all said yes, and they made this art exhibition called Rastos. This was at the time when Piñera increased his neoliberal culture policies and policies in general in Chile. And we had the great uprising in Chile. And he started to call it a war. Piñera called it a war and started to shoot people on the street. And then this group of Chilean artists that all were kids by parents who flew from the Pinochet regime, said, like, okay, we cannot continue with this exhibition. We want this exhibition to stay open, but we want our works to be veiled. The museum said no, it's okay during the opening day, but we have a contract here, it must be open. And then they negotiated, they didn't boycott the museum, they accepted that they could publish a manifest, and in my journal Paletten we published a manifest, and I was invited to have a debate, a dialogue around politics, art, and the museum. And this is most of the time how it works in the art business. It's almost a boycott a lot of the time. But what I want to say with this example is that it's not enough, talking to these Chilean Swedish artists, it's not enough to defend for them the liberal notion of art that has legitimized philosophically the culture policies of Sweden that made it possible to build this museum, and also for this museum to get private money from Chile to make this show. It's not enough to them to say, okay, we want the liberal culture policy back, and we only act towards the violence of the illiberalism of neoliberalism that we saw in the case of Piñera. We are against Piñera's politics per se. So we are in solidarity with the uprising. We are in solidarity with the uprising, and we don't know where the uprising will take us. It's not necessarily the case that it will be a better society. It's not necessarily the case that will be a more democratic society. And it's not necessarily the case that will be a worse society, but it could be even better society with another notion of culture that is less colonial, less imperial, and are challenging the Western notion of art. So my last slide. And this is my summary. So what I can say is that, okay, the imagined community of contemporary art, the reason why we can be in solidarity with friends in Russia and be against Putin is dependent philosophically, the way I see it, on the aesthetic philosophical tradition that is legitimizing the culture policies in Norway, for example. So we can use this, we have to use this somehow. But at the same time, this imagined community, of course, there is no real space for this. It's a negative notion. We are not a community. We are unequal. We have different conditions. But without this imagination, there will be no interest by private money or by liberal government to support art and art institutions. This is both the condition for the art washing that we see amongst oligarchs and other entrepreneurs, and for the promise of a democratic nation state of civilized subjects and their others. So that's why I think it's super important with what you say about the feminist approach to the current situation. I mean, you can call it decolonial, you can call it feminist, you can call it anything that has a problem with this distinction between the civilized and the non-civilized. So the current boycotts in the arts of oligarch-funded art institutions must not be reduced to a defense of institutions of aesthetic cultures financed by good entrepreneurs or by the budget of a liberal democratic nation state. Also, it must be seen as a strategic act in solidarity with the uprisings of the illiberal core of neoliberal governance that are supporting the oligarchs of the West and the East and the North and the South. It must also be seen as a way of breaking with the imagined community of contemporary art and questioning the philosophical foundations for aesthetic culture and the separation of art institutions in liberal democratic nation states and beyond, as in Russia. This questioning must therefore not be seen as separate from the current struggle of decolonization and even the abolishment of museums and art journals and art critics like myself, since the separation of art, as we know, has been an integrated part of the colonial modernity that we are benefiting from. So that was my contribution.
Thank you. And now for the final presentation, before we go into a general discussion, Trondheim, would you like to say something?
Yes, please. Thank you. My perspective starts from here, from Trondheim, and from I think the experience many institutions had in the beginning, just after the invasion, and we were, like many others, I think, too, trapped in a kind of strange situation that has nothing to do with the invasion, but with the post-COVID situation. We had so many postponed events, so that after the reopening, entire March, April is fully booked, and we would have no time nor to boycott, nor to do supportive events for the Ukrainian people. Therefore, I also admire those who did, but interestingly, it gave us time to follow the debate on boycott and what the others were thinking and doing, and I think that was good for us. What I find surprising is how quickly we achieved a kind of consensus around these questions, because we are now less than a week ago, the Kulturrådet made an event based on the same issues, and I think we all agree today that this is not a time for cancel culture. Norsk Orkester and Teater- and Orkesterforening made these general principles as a kind of advice for other institutions that we should boycott all theater institutions or other cultural actors that are financed by the Russian government, but no individual artists and no independent artists. And I think that's a very obvious and good principle, and I believe that is the general consensus in Norway right now, which I think is good. On a more general level regarding boycott, the culture serves some functions in society that makes boycott very difficult, because we are also in times of war we are supposed to lead to a kind of dialogue after all. So a general boycott would be very problematic in many respects. And if we see towards earlier historical boycotts, like the cultural boycott of the apartheid regime that lasted for nearly 50 years, or at least 40, we see that was also not a general boycott towards the cultural life of South Africa. It was an opening for a cultural life on certain terms. American artists would certainly go having a concert in South Africa as long as the concert would have a multiracial audience. So I consider this not to be a general boycott, but a kind of act of solidarity, open to dialogue and open to interaction with the South African regime as well. And I think that is interesting also in the context we are now. I don't know. At least I have never experienced this kind of boycott where we, in a kind of spontaneous solidarity, tries to respond to an acceptable invasion of Ukraine. But still, it's very difficult to see that it will have any kind of immediate effect that. The cultural life of Trondheim boycotts whatever Russian institution, but it will have a function here, also the solidarity of the Trondheim people towards the Ukrainian people. It could have an effect upon us. It could perhaps have an effect upon the Ukrainian people and the relationship as well, which is good. But I don't think Putin will matter very much.
But does this respond somehow to a kind of? I mean, there is a kind of polarization, a kind of will to polarization through social media and what have you that strengthens this idea that you should be for something and against something, and that you have to find those categories.
Yeah, certainly. But what kind of polarization is that? As I believe most people in Norway, they act upon the same kind of spontaneous solidarity, which is generously good. But on the other hand, who knows if we are influenced by the media or whatever? So what is the long-term consequence of this kind of solidarity? Because we also see the political development that now the Western countries are actually closer together now than they were ever before, as a direct consequence of the invasion. And our solidarity, which is good, could also have this kind of political consequences, that it actually strengthens NATO towards Russia and sharpens the polarization. We should certainly be aware of that, I think.
Yeah. Okay. I also think that this polarization is a negative thing, and is something that we have art to steer clear of. That art's role is not it can be to present an efficient picture or an effective picture, but should be above all to clarify what is complicated. I mean, what art can present ambiguous and also in ways self-contradictory events and facts and situations in a way that's impossible for political or for scientific discourse, and this is one of the things, Frederick, that I would not want to abolish in the future.
No, I don't. I'm not saying that I want to abolish. I'm just saying that there is a movement out there that that doesn't end with the notion of art that in the European states were institutionalized after the Second War. That's my only point. And of course, abolition doesn't mean, it means like reconstruction.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not, I mean, we can have art anyhow.
Yeah, yeah. Yana, you talked about the need for feminization of politics and politics, including art. What aspects of this issue of boycotts what would be a feminine? I think I know what you're going to answer, but what would be a feminist or a more feminine approach to boycott?
I think that actually I want to thank Frederick because it was very interesting to think about this example of a Chilean artist right now, which made me think about just various cases that happened within the current boycott, and which I think are very important in terms of thinking about the power relationship between art institutions and artists. Because I just want to bring two cases maybe to the table to discuss. One is that happened just recently in Estonia, in Tallinn. There is an exhibition of with the participation of Moscow conceptualists, so it's a historical, already like dissident Soviet artist, and the museum removed all of the works of Moscow conceptualists from the exhibition, and just to have this kind of and just left the shadows of the work, like this blank spaces, and then the descriptions. Saying that artists are not guilty, something like that, but in the current context it can be misread, so that we decided to open exhibition with this kind of empty spaces. And then I was thinking about this, what happened in Denmark, in Kunsthal Charlottenburg, when the Russian artist was, they just removed him from the exhibition, and then there was a public discussion, and people actually stood up for more complex understanding of and also because he was kind of openly critical to Putin regime, and then the work has been returned after kind of the public stood up for the artist. And it is interesting because usually, and then of course I think Russian Pavilion and Venice Biennale, where the artists themselves decided that it's not going to open this year. And I think these three cases are very different in terms of how do we envision the role of the institutions in maintaining conflicts and reflecting on the power structures embedded between it. And I think that there is, again, of course, I think my immediate answer is that there is no ready-made answer that we can have, but I don't. I think that institution also has a responsibility to come to a decision in a dialogue with artists, and not just imposing the power over and ownership over the space in a kind of one-sided disagreement.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think what you said now, Yana, is very interesting. This example from Estonia, where they remove paintings by Russian Soviet dissidents, actually. And we should bear in mind that this is something the Putin regime now makes use of. And by doing such things, we play arguments into their hands. On several occasions now in TV debates and also in one speech by Putin, I noticed that they make this a comparison or analogy to what happened to the Jews in Germany in 1930 to what is now happening with the Russians abroad. There's an anti-Russian hysteria, Russophobic hysteria, and I don't know if they make it up, but there was a case in Germany where probably a private hospital that did not refuse to treat Russian citizens. And we have a hotel or two in Norway that do not welcome Russian guests. And one of these TV hosts, who is very dominant, I would say, propagandist of Putin, not very much reviewed. He himself is a Jew, and he said that what they are doing now, it resembles what they did against the Jews in the 1930s, only the Nazis started out more mildly. So this is what I said about by-effects. We should also think about the by-effects, and we should not give this regime arguments to support their kind of paranoid idea about Russophobia abroad. Because if we are behaving like this, it's no more paranoia, it's almost true.
We're playing into their vision, their description of the situation. Fredrik?
At the same time, I wonder if this, I mean, on a more local level, for example, this example from the Museum of World Culture in Gothenburg, when the artists and myself talked to the curator and about the decision not to follow their demands or in that kind of discussion, something that I see a lot came up in Western art institutions. And this argument is kind of similar to yours. And I'm not sure if it's how it works, but from a kind of, the argument goes like this. Okay, now we are very pressured as a museum. It might be cuts next year, and there is a right-wing political movement here that is the only party with a total other culture politics. And if they come into power, and we have taken this kind of stand, they have arguments for just doing as we have seen in Poland. And that's why we cannot act. Let's have a discussion. Let's reproduce the Bildung tradition. Let's have self-education. Let's work within this and just stay where we are. And that was the argument from that curator. And he also argued that if we go in, if we follow the demand of the artist, it will also be a way to say that, okay, also commercial forces can legitimize their positions within the museum. But I'm not sure if the politics are changing in a country like Sweden or in Norway, if this has any effect or not. But in the Russian case, I'm sure. But it's kind of it's a tricky one, because this fear within institutions is also a dilemma.
Yeah, and not doing something in order not to play into someone else's description is perhaps not the best moral vantage point. Although it can be a perfectly true dilemma, as in the Russian case. We need something more, maybe.
I don't know.
Trond, did you?
Actually, may I ask a question?
Yes.
Because it was very interesting what you were saying about the current situation in Russia, and given that you are dealing with a regime that demonizes the West as a part of the world where we are not anymore able to talk about father and mother, but parent 1 and 2, etc., etc. It's very easy to imagine that also the cultural boycott could have very strange consequences, and that we are not foreseeing. So, although I'm positive to the boycott in terms of that it has some important functions here, as for the solidarity, perhaps even for the Ukrainian people. But what is your impression of the effect it has upon the Russian regime and Russia? Now we're talking about boycotting, for example, the ballets and the theater institutions that are actually financed by Putin. But how will that be conceived in Russia?
What do you think, Yana?
I think now they don't really think about arts because it's so many economic sanctions and boycotts. It's never been, and it's not a priority of Putin's regime, the arts. And of course they can use it as an example for some of the propaganda speeches, but it's not. It doesn't stay anywhere high, in the hierarchy in a way.
I think it's a kind of loss. Of course, they have other things to think of now, probably, like attacking a neighboring country. But I think it's a loss of prestige when this Gergiev was fired as a conductor, as a chief conductor of the Münchner Philharmoniker, for instance, and when the Bolshoi theater are not invited anymore. And this high-profile regime, people who are close to the regime, artists who perform the kind of culture that Russia, even the conservative regime now, is proud about. It's a loss of prestige. But when people with whom I think most Norwegian cultural workers with partners in Russia are being boycotted, I think the regime just thinks that this is fine. Now that they won't have any funding for these oppositional activities. Mm. But it's a loss of prestige when they are no longer invited and so on. But it's also a source of, they can, in a way, tell the people, see how strong we are. They are so afraid of us that they don't even dare to play Tchaikovsky.
But there's an interesting. I mean, it's interesting in a way that we're punishing the state of Russia and its prestige institutions, and at the same time you have these Russian oligarchs who are whitewashing their activities by supporting liberal artist institutions, and I mean it's a complex target in a way.
But I think that's one good thing. It's not. It feels weird to say good thing, but that I don't know if this is a culture boycott of Berlin Kunsthalle. I wouldn't call that a culture boycott, really. That's a boycott against many different things. But what it highlights, of course, is an attention to both the historical conditions for art in modernity, who has paid for it. Yeah. Historically, but also how institutions worldwide are financed by this or that. Mm.
But then, of course, the situation goes on, and the Kunsthalle is boycotted, but keeping it open or starting it, or whatever, is not really an economic issue, so it will stay there, and then eventually, some artist will exhibit there, and what will happen? I mean, collegial self-censorship, or the censorship of one's colleagues, or
I mean, it's also real effects.
Are we solving anything? I mean, we're forced to do this in a way because of the moral issues attached to it, but in the end, we end up self-harming.
I mean, my problem is like when one is against boycott or for boycott, and I think we all agree that we cannot, like, that's impossible. It's impossible to be for or against boycott. But when one is deciding to do it, when one is doing it as a part of the strategy towards something. It's a chance, like it might not work, and it might be worse.
Yeah.
But I think in the case of Berlin Kunsthal, it's I mean, the effects when artists are kind of leaving the exhibition, this means something. Like it's a virus. I mean, because easier for artists to leave exhibitions, other exhibitions.
Yeah.
I think that it is very important now, again, not to forget that every day Ukraine has been destroyed, and that it's not only boycott, which is important instrument, or not to boycott, and speak about these things, but also mourning. Maybe to me is a more adequate reaction actually on what is going on, because to continue with the Gergiev, this conductor was fired, and then I guess also everybody read in the news that the main star of Bolshoi theater, she moved to Holland and kind of claimed this anti-war statement because she's against war. But at the same time, one of the dancers of Kiev ballet theater died under the bombs, and nobody wrote about it. So it's like the economy of attention sometimes kind of has this tendency to go to this. Yeah, I mean, war is also an entertainment. Everybody is reading and the news and everything. And who, if not artists, will kind of claim for that? And I think about Carl Einstein, this critic who was writing, in the 30s in a very similar time, and he was claiming that it is important that sometimes there is time when there is not so much art, because we cannot. I mean, that's how I see my personal responsibility. That we cannot supports an illusion that life's going on like it is, because it doesn't, and it will never be. And it is it's like boycott and no boycott. It belongs to the peace times, It's something that is out of question actually right now, and we have to rethink our practices. But at the same time, as I said, I still find it's very important to allow different kind of time flows to happen at the same time, to have this time complex relationship that is not only about present, it's also about past, it's also about the future. And this is what is a feminist response to have it accommodated, and always kind of cut things which are kind of beyond the kind of exceeding the urgency, which are the excess in this sense, I think.
Trond, did you want to say something?
Yeah. Right now, where we are, just after the invasion, where everything is relatively fresh and where the solidarity is important, I think it's quite easy to define the boycott as an act of solidarity, and it doesn't have anything to do with cancel culture or all the other issues we're discussing in other contexts, because it's so isolated to this particular invasion. It doesn't have anything to do with Russians or not even Putin. I'd say it is this invasion, and it is a spontaneous reaction towards that. But of course, if this lasts for a long time, this will change. let's say if Russia stops the invasion, should we then still boycott Putinists or Russian theaters? So then we are crossing a border into a more general cancel culture issue. So I think what is important with all these issues that they should be seen individually, because they can also change over time and in various contexts.
Yeah, that's a good point. Before we open the discussion to everyone, Jörn, you wanted to comment on that, but I also want to ask you,
okay,
as a political scientist, and your reading is a bit different than ours. I mean, your physical read, like the sources you read. How is cultural boycott seen in relation to economic boycott at this point, I mean, this huge. I mean, one thing is different about this boycott compared to earlier on the economic level is that suddenly McDonald's and Starbucks and everyone pulls out of Russia.
yeah.
That would, I mean, you could argue that being part of being the conductor of an orchestra, orchestra and classical music or whatever, should a company that serves people coffee, and is there a moral obligation for them to pull out of Russia? Really? I mean, do we want companies to be? We want companies certainly to be ethical, but do we want them to be political?
Yeah, it's a very good question. When it comes to McDonald's and other international firms, I think it's for them it's a kind of statement, and I think it's fully possible to get better burgers in Moscow and St. Petersburg than what you get in McDonald's. So it's really not. There are a lot of when it comes to the economic sanctions, they are harsh and they have created problems. And again, some side effects. I read yesterday in newspaper Klassekampen that people who would like to go out of Russia now or flee, they are in trouble because their cards do not work anymore and they have to use the card to pay for the visa fee, for instance. One side effect. And in a way, it's a bit... you know, here we are discussing the moral obligation to boycott and so on, but if we look at what is going on in the economy, okay, it has created problems for Russia so far, but as Putin has said, they beat us and we just harden. And he says, I've heard him now say that, okay, we are used to sanctions. We had sanctions in the Soviet Union. We have had sanctions since 2014. And it just helps us accelerate our work for technological and economic sovereignty. So, and okay, back to what I started out with this, we are discussing our moral obligation, but when we look at the economic sanctions and other sanctions, they are a bit very much afraid of doing things that might harm us. Let's take Norway. The cooperation with Russia on fisheries is continued because if we stop that, it would harm us. Also nuclear safety, also rescue at sea, the rescue operations at sea in the Barents Sea is continued. And Bulgaria, Hungary, Germany, Italy are still buying Russian oil and gas and pay for it. So it's in a way, following up on what Yana said about the feminine approach, a masculine approach, masculinist approach, that I would not suggest. I'm not a supporter of that. But that would be just to go all out and boycott everything that was Russia. And then be aware that we take all Russians as hostages. But just no economic activity with them, no activity whatsoever. No oil, no gas, no nothing. And let them drown in the Barents Sea. It's not our problem. That would have some effect, because probably the system would collapse, or they would become North Korea. But that's too late for Russia. So we are talking about this boycott and the sanctions and so on, but they are not that hard actually still.
But I mean, surely in terms of, I understand that you're like drawing a very hard picture, but also in terms of this fear of hurting ourselves, there could be again a feminist approach of saying, well, rescue at sea is one thing. You want to keep that. But I mean, we can choose more selectively and include certain things that will hurt us. I mean, we can, okay, fishing, it's going to hurt, but we should do it. Rescue at sea, no, we want to keep that for everyone's sake. Nuclear safety, difficult.
And let the Germans freeze.
Oh, yeah, or
so okay.
Yeah.
But also, I think again, it's very important not to forget that sanctions primarily hurt people with no money, like the poorest people. Yeah. I was talking to my grandmother the other day, and she was the doctor, and she had to buy some medical socks which are German, and like the pension is like $150, and the socks are now $100. So, and yes, like my parents can help her, but there are so many of the people who cannot. And what is going on now also with all the pharmacies, you know, and it's about yeah, I don't know what will happen to those who've been already beyond the kind of poverty line, and this is the whole Russia, apart from, you know, Moscow, St. Petersburg, the big cities, and it's just. And McDonald's, yes, it's not about burgers. It's about 200,000 workplaces that McDonald's provided, and all the foreign companies that are leaving. It's an insane. It's so many factories. Everything was from IKEA to all the cars. I mean, all this production. It was giving so many workplaces for people, and now all these workplaces are gone. I mean, for now, most of the foreign companies said that they will pay for their workers for like 2 or 3 months. But the amount of like what will happen, you know, after this 2 or 3 months, I'm really afraid, because like Putin doesn't care about people. I mean, this is obvious that it's people are resources, and this is exactly what we have to fight against. That people are not resources, and every life is. And I mean, yeah, it's just unfathomable. No matter how many days will pass, it's just.
So, do we have any questions, or anyone who want to bring something else to the discussion from the audience?
Yes, thank you, museum, and thank you, panelists. I think this is extremely important, what we're doing right now, and I wish it would happen more often, and perhaps even faster than it did. I also find the discussion a little bit comfortable, in a way that we all agree on this kind of, yes, we can live without Shostakovich for some time, but I think instead of talking about cultural boycotts, I would rather want to discuss what is an act of solidarity, and be a little bit more active than just saying no to something, but also actually doing something. instead of saying no to certain people being invited to Norway, perhaps we should set up infrastructure to invite people here. Perhaps we should have emergency residencies. Perhaps we should pull some money together, go in a bus and pick up some refugees at the border. Perhaps this museum can house, I don't know how many people. I think these are the discussions we should have, and not only be on the kind of comfortable side of saying no to certain things, but also act more. That's, I think, what I miss in a way from the conversation so far. How could an act of solidarity look like besides just saying no to something? Yeah.
Yes, I mean, we have been talking in MIST, the organization that this museum belongs to, and we're doing a small thing this weekend. All of the proceeds from entry fees and so on go to the Red Cross and their work in Ukraine. But another idea is to invite our Ukrainian colleagues to work and to fit them into work projects, because bringing people to Norway is one thing, but also to have a context and to be able to. But that's of course a very difficult bureaucratic procedure and so on. But this is something that I've also taken to other art museums in Norway. And residencies are opening up. I know that Nordisk Kunstnersenter Dale have increased the number of artists that they're accepting and have invited. So there are some things being done.
And here I think it's also important that it also goes for Russian dissidents. I think it's I don't know how to prioritize this kind of passport issue, but I think there's victims all over the place. But it also goes for Yemeni artists and for Palestinian artists and people living under bomb shelling all over the world. I think, it's solidarity requires a radical position, I think, and we cannot be comfortable while we are acting in solidarity. I think, now I lost it, but maybe I'll pass it on. Maybe I'll return. Thanks.
Just a comment, but I think solidarity is about the kind of relationships that we've all been building up during times of quote-unquote globalization, because it's no longer being a part of just one country. You're part of a group that stretches around the world. And it's important to maintain this solidarity with those groups. I don't feel any power to boycott oligarchs in Norway or Sweden or Russia, but I would feel a power to continue to associate with artists and cultural workers that have been, I wouldn't say on my level, but in some way it is on my level. And I think that's an important way to think of stratosphere as opposed to borders, clusters. Yeah.
I remember where I lost it. Solidarity, yes, I think it requires this radical position, and I think it's also, I mean, we all know the amazing work by Martha Rosler of bringing the war home, and of course this was a slogan during the Vietnam War. But I also think we have responsibility in the North to fight the same kind of Putinism, to fight the same kind of fascism, patriarchy that we see also in Norway and the Scandinavian countries. So I think for me this is also a way of acting in solidarity with Ukraine and Russia, is to fight the same structures where we meet them here in our everyday life in Norway and Trondheim, and yeah. So I think it's not only something that's out there; it's very much the same tendencies we can find here in Norway. So wherever they are, we should strike back, and I think this is also an act of solidarity.
And maybe this kind of heightened situation of conflict makes us more aware of those issues, and that what we can take from this becomes a greater awareness of the divides and of the various possible positions.
I was thinking about Sami people in Russia, and I was thinking if it's ever will be that Norwegian state would invite, Sami people to, if they want to, that they have a right to be here and to live here and have a permanent residency, for example, as this kind of also extended understanding of the nation beyond, the border of contemporary Norway. What do you think? Can like people from here? I was just asking if you imagine this being feasible in the contemporary political climate, something as radical.
Yeah. I've been to Lujavr, Lavozera, a couple of times,
yes.
And met with a Russian Sami.
Yeah.
And I know that one of them, I'm not able to recall his name, he has now fled Russia and is staying in Oslo. Probably you know him, I don't remember his name. But I think that would be extremely controversial in Russia, because the authorities have been all the time very nervous about this trans-border nation. Mm-hmm. And it sounds a bit that is paranoid, because the Samis there are not very many people. And this huge country, and if they have some contacts with Sami in Karasjok, it's and they're really, as you know, they're really nervous about it. And if they started to argue that we belong to a bigger nation and we can go to Norway, I think they might come in peril and come in some trouble with the authorities very soon and be jailed. And I saw one propaganda. There wasn't a video, but some pictures of Sami in Lavozera. It's on the Kola Peninsula. It's a settlement with a lot of Samis. Most people who live there are Russians or Komi, another Finno-Ugric people, but they are concentrated there, the Samis. And they were on the sledges with the reindeer and this huge Z, which is the symbol of this aggression. So that was a propaganda thing.
There is one there.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to share my experience from the Iranian artists community and what happens when we have sanctions and boycotts. Usually, as I understood in Iran, after 40 years of sanctions continuously, and it's getting worse and worse day by day, what happens is that the government gets more aggressive and the people get more passive. It doesn't work as we see from outside. And what happens to the artists, the one that they had the chance to work and the space to talk, they don't have it now. Like, I have so many friends, like, they are working to make a film about women's rights, all the issues that we have. And I know so many of them, 9 years, 5 years, 6 years, they cannot complete their work because they don't have the support. So what the isolation in general, sanctions or boycott, does to the government, like in Iran or in Russia, I mean, in Russia it's very different because Iranians say no West, no East. So you can isolate them. But Russia doesn't say no East. They have good relationship with China and with Iran. I mean, with this nuclear deal, they can do the trade. So the thing that happens with this situation in Iran is gets the community that they can talk, it gets weaker and weaker. It happened to me, myself. It takes longer time to work, to distribute the work, to talk about any right that we want to talk. So it won't help. I mean, in the short term, maybe if you do the complete isolation, it gives the opportunity to have the contraction in the power. So they may stop for a while, then you have time to act against that hostile situation. But I don't think that is the case with Russia. So in case of Iran, like I can say they have sources to continue this situation that we have for other 10 years or maybe 20 years. So my suggestion always is that we need to support the ones who are working not just against the government or against the violence or censorship, but the one who are working for women's rights, the one who are working for communities' rights. This is the way that we can help them. That's my conclusion of having this situation. Yeah.
Thank you, Mohammed. I think it's very, very valuable, and I didn't say that, but I also really wanted to say that, of course, as everyone else, I'm always reading the news, reading the comments, and it's a lot kind of pressure, like comments from people from the US and people from Europe, like Russians should go to the streets, why don't they going out? And it's just the Western experience of democracy doesn't work. We have to address to South America. We have to address the experience of the African continent, where it's just completely different experience of democracy. It's not the models that can be just applied, exactly because there are so many kind of the oppression is always intersectional, and one part of Russia cannot be like at all, like Ingushetia, it cannot be compared to Karelia, and it's like completely different like cultures, people, languages. I mean, some of the lengths of being under oppression of the Russian Empire, it also varies from one region to another. And everything that is represented now, it's anyway more or less it's Moscow, St. Petersburg, and like big cities. And there is the political culture is not, it doesn't really exist in Russia, and it's coming, of course, also again from the legacy of the Soviet Union. And the idea of this public space is very different.
I couldn't agree more, and I think, Johan, when you invite us to this panel, I thought about this. What I liked about it is like, okay, it's a start of something that I saw that, okay, that perhaps could be done here in Trondheim and so on. And at the same time, I realized that, okay, there is this perspective of boycott and sanctions as if they are, I mean, boycott, the story of boycott himself. I mean, boycott, it's a kind of it's an action within an economical system that we all agree on. And it's an action within a political system that we all agree on. So when we are having discussions about if sanctions and boycotts and so on, of course, we tend to repeat a notion of the culture sphere as only the site for representation and debate, and not so much for what you guys are talking about when it comes to actually using the human resources and the facilities to actually do something together with people that are perhaps not even agreeing on the very notion of the economy that we are trying to use as a way to pressure politics in different directions.
Okay, so maybe we should continue the discussion with the microphones off. Thank you very much, Yana, Fredrik, Jörn, and Trond, for this discussion, and thank you everyone for coming. As I said, this weekend the museums will be donating their proceeds from admissions. So, although many of you are artists and exempt, feel free to pay admission. And of course, also this weekend is the opening of the Hanna Ryggen Triennial and our exhibition with Hegelönne upstairs. So yes, so see you all again this weekend, and thank you very much for coming.